In the Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Sunflower Smasher build. This is a build using the Shadow Sunflower Blossom weapon. A lot of people have been asking me to make a build using this weapon, so let's get into how you would do that and what's really great about this weapon. So as usual, let's start with the weapon itself, the Shadow Sunflower Blossom. This is a weapon that you get from defeating the Erdtree avatar and exchanging the Remembrance in Roundtable Hole. And this is a colossal weapon, more importantly a colossal hammer, which means it has phenomenal stance damage. It is the weapon type in the game that has the highest stance damage per attack, so that's definitely something we lean into with this build. This weapon does both physical and holy damage, relatively even split between the two, with requirements in strength and faith. And faith scales a little bit better than strength, so if you take your faith up to 50 versus strength up to 50, you're going to have more damage if you go that way first. However, once you hit 50 faith, strength starts to outperform faith in terms of melee damage, but you have options. You could continue to go up in faith instead of increasing strength in order to use a sacred seal that scales with faith and get better incantation scaling, or you could choose to get more melee damage and increase your strength and maybe then cast spells using the claw mark seal, although probably less effectively than a regular sacred seal that only scales with faith. So the option is really up to you. In this build, I have opted for a split stat distribution between strength and faith. And the reason I did that is to get the most possible damage out of our weapon skill, Shadow Sunfire Headbutt, because the damage of this weapon skill is basically the same distribution of damage as the weapon does itself. So if you have half physical and half holy, this weapon skill will deal half physical and half holy damage. And what Shadow Sunflower Headbutt does is it does like a wind-up that's kind of long that then slams the weapon down in an AoE explosion. Then if you follow up again, it does 2 more hits that deal small explosions. And then if you hit the weapon skill again, it will follow up with another attack for a total of 4 hits. Some interesting things about this weapon skill, though, are that the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prothesis, Talismans are not triggered by this weapon's skills use. It only considers the whole chain to be one attack. So you're not going to trigger this very effectively, even if you use this in a group of enemies and you're hitting multiple enemies at the same time. It does not seem to trigger in my testing. And the weapon skill itself does pretty decent stance damage. I think it's about 65 total stance damage if you pull off the whole combo, which is not bad. If you're using something like the Stone Barbed Cracked here, when you pull this off, you're going to get about 21, 22 more stance damage out of that, which is like 83, 87, something like that. So that's a lot of stance damage, and it can stance break any boss that has 80 stance. And the weapon skill deals pretty significant damage in my testing if you pull off the whole combo, and the fact that it can AoE is great, particularly if you walk into a crowd of enemies. But you might be wondering, how do you use this, in a boss fight where the animation is so long, you're just going to get eviscerated while you're using it, and that's a big consideration for a lot of weapon skills in Shadow of the Erdtree. Well, the answer to that is that this weapon, out of every single weapon I've tested in this game so far, has the most hyper armor I have ever seen. It's possible that there are other weapons with more hyper armor or other weapon skills with more hyper armor than this one, but frankly, it has a metric boatload. You can literally just face tank through so many boss attacks and enemy attacks and continue to use this weapon skill that if you don't mind trading damage, this just becomes a one-click button win build. Like literally, you don't need to learn the attack patterns of a lot of bosses, or maybe you need to learn them mildly, because you simply tank through so many of their hits, and usually you end up stance breaking them, getting a critical hit, and then you can just follow up with another combo. As long as you have a high enough health pool and you can top yourself off with healing flasks here and there in a boss fight, you can just keep trading damage and you usually come out ahead more often than not. And there are exceptions, of course. You can't tank every single hit in this game. There are a lot of attacks that are just too strong for you to tank. Divine Beast has a couple that you can't tank through. Dragons have a couple you can't tank through, etc. But the vast majority of boss attacks in this game, you can just tank straight through them and just get the whole attack chain of the weapon skill off, which is absolutely incredible. So Sacred Seal-wise, I'm using the Clawmark Seal. I don't have really any spells slotted in this build other than Golden Vow and Flame grant me strength, because I wanted to showcase the weapon itself, but you do have a almost perfect stat spread for using this Sacred Seal in this build. So if there are other incantations you want to use, then absolutely use them. Elden Stars is not a bad addition to this build. It doesn't deal a ton of damage. There are a lot of boss fights you can throw it up at the beginning, and that would continue to do stance damage to the boss while you're attacking it, allowing you to get stance breaks even faster. Now, obviously, if you went the other route and went 24 strength or even lower, you could go 16 strength and two-hand this weapon and put all the rest of the points in faith. You have a little bit lower melee damage on average, and the weapon skill would deal a little bit less damage, but it would allow you to cast incantations more effectively. And I think probably if you're trying to go for the hybrid build where you really want to spell cast in addition to this, probably the better way to go too. And you would probably use something like the Erdtree seal here if you're going that route, assuming that you have, about 70 or so faith or higher. So for armor for this build, I kind of went with a Mod Podge of pieces, but made sure I got over 51 poise. Even though you don't need it for the combo, it's still nice to have that for some attacks in the game so that you don't get interrupted. And if you are hybriding and you're casting spells, definitely want to make sure you have that so you don't get interrupted when you're casting. So I'm using the pumpkin helm here, the raptor's black feathers, and I'm using 2 pieces of the new Radon armor set in order to get the kind of style I have. I really like the pumpkin helm with this build. I kind of feel like it matches the sunflower theme, has this kind of autumn look to it, particularly when you add the raptor's black feathers. And the raptor's black feathers also increase our jump attack damage. Do lots of jump attacks with this build in order to deal significant stance damage to bosses and enemies. So for talismans for this build, we have the two-handed sword talisman because I'm two-handing this weapon most of the time. This will increase the damage of basically all your attacks but your weapon skill. So anytime you're not using the weapon skill, which is predominantly out on the landscape, you will use it sometimes out there. You're going to get like serious advantage out of this, and you'll still get advantage out of it in boss fights because you just can't use the weapon skill constantly all the time in every boss fight. And then obviously we have Shard of Alexander to further boost the damage of our weapon skill. We use this all the time in boss fights. You want every single hit to deal maximum damage, so we'll be using that one. I also have the two-headed turtle talisman here for stamina recovery. Even though the weapon skill itself doesn't use a ton of stamina and we do have quite a bit of endurance, I do find that just regular attacks with this weapon in general use a lot of stamina, and you really can't have enough stamina with this build in order to be able to dodge, attack with the substantial amount of stamina you use when you attack, and then be able to attack again or use a weapon skill. So I have that one here as well. I will say, though, you can swap out the two-headed turtle talisman when you're out on the landscape where you don't have as much stamina issues for something like the claw talisman or the axe talisman, or maybe even the lacerating tree talisman, in order to get damage out of different attacks, whether you're doing charged heavy attacks, jump attacks, running attacks. You can do all of these with this weapon, and really depending on what your preference is, those might work well. We already are boosting our jump attack damage with Raptor's Black Feathers. Adding the Claw Talisman here is also not a bad idea to further boost that. And it makes a lot more sense out on the landscape where you have less stamina issues. And then the last spot, I have Blade of Mercy to increase my attack power after I do a critical strike. Because we stance break bosses rather easily in this build, you're going to increase your attack power. That will further boost your weapon skill attacks after you stance break, which is great. Out on the landscape, you tend to kill things far more quickly, and you don't really do a lot of critical attacks. So you might want to swap this out with Crusade Insignia out on the landscape to get more damage after you kill an enemy. Now, you could also add the Sacred Scorpion Charm to this build to further boost holy damage, but because only half of our damage is holy, you're going to take increased damage for only half the benefit of the talisman. So that's kind of up to you. If you're using spells that deal holy damage and you went the hybrid route, this might be a good one to slot in here somewhere. But if you're not, I think it's probably just not worth it in my opinion. And for spells, I have Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Flame Grant Me Strength will boost the physical portion of our damage and our weapon skill. I only use this for boss fights. Same with Golden Vow. It increases our protection and damage. I only buff right before bosses. The rest of the time, your damage is so high anyway, you don't need to buff. And obviously, if you're using the Clawmark Seal, or if you went the Faith route with Erdtree Seal, you might want to add spells in here to match, your playstyle. Recommend holy damage spells in order to take advantage of, the Flask of Wonders Physique that you can put Holy Shroud and Crack Tear in, or if you're using Sacred Scorpion Charm, that would boost the damage of both your attacks and spells. Attribute-wise for this build, I have 55 Vigor, 30 Mind, 40 Endurance, 45 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 45 Faith, 9 Arcane at level 173. 55 Vigor is there so we can trade damage and not die. We'll take this up to 60 eventually. We trade damage a lot with this build, so really having more health is good. You don't need to go higher than that. We have 30 Mind because we do buff with spells occasionally. We have a kind of expensive weapon skill, although you don't need to use all the follow-ups all the time. Highly recommend when you're out on the landscape only using enough inputs to kill the enemy. You don't need to use all 3 inputs every time. 40 Endurance is there to give us tons of stamina for this build because the weapon uses a lot when you attack, and also for us to wear heavy protection armor so we can trade hits and not die. You can wear probably a little bit heavier armor than we're wearing, but I'm wearing a chest piece for jump attack damage. Pumpkin Helm for fashion, so really it's kind of up to you. And then I have 45 Strength and 45 Faith. This is to hit the sweet spot for the Clawmark Sealed, so you can cast effectively, even though I'm not showcasing that in this build. It's still set up that way for you if you want to do it. If you're trying to maximize melee damage, you'd have 50 Faith and 40 Strength here, and then take Strength up to 50, and then take Faith up to 80 and Strength up to 80. However, if you want to go the Faith route, you could keep your Strength at like 16, two-hand the weapon, and then just crank Faith and use, as I mentioned, like the Erdtree Sealed Spellcast. You have slightly less melee damage, but your spells would probably hit a lot harder. 12 Dexterity is there because I'm an Astrologer. Same with Intelligence. I can't do anything about these stats, so disregard those. You do need 8 Dexterity for this weapon, but most classes have that anyway, and you don't need any Arcane. So for Flask of Wondrous Physique, I have the Holy Shroud and Cracked here to give us increased damage with Holy damage. Even though only half of our damage is Holy, we're still getting decent benefit out of that. And there are only so many, Crystal Cracked tiers that are going to benefit this build anyway. So that's a good one to have. And again, if you went the hybrid route and you're casting Holy spells, it's going to be good for those spells. And then I have the Stone Barb Cracked tier here, which makes it easier to stance break since we're going for stance breaks in a lot of boss fights. This has a very kind of short duration, so typically you want to use it right when you get into the boss fight and then try and go for those stance breaks very quickly. And then when it comes to Great Runes, there are several that I think are good. You could use Radons for the FP, stamina, and health. All those are always good. You could use Millennias because you trade damage a lot, and that could regain your health back while you're trading damage, making this build even easier. Or you could go Morgoths for even more health so that you can trade damage without having to heal as often. So that wraps up my Sunflower Smasher build. I absolutely love this weapon. It's such a cake weapon to use if you find yourself struggling with the mechanics of Elden Ring or struggling to learn boss patterns. This weapon can kind of bypass that. So I highly recommend using it for those type of players. As always, if you have further tips for this build, please leave them in the comments. And if you have questions, leave them there as well, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can.